This presentation covers the Landings Association's assessment proposal for the next 3 years. And when we say assessment, think of annual property owner dues. First, what is the Landings Association? The Landings Association, quite simply, is you. It's all property owners. And it's completely separate from the Landings Club with a separate board, staff, responsibilities, and budget. TLA, which is the Landings Association, provides services to all owners and maintains common property to preserve property values and amenities. And some of those are 715 acres of common property. And part of that is 91 miles of roads and 22 miles of paved community paths. One note, the Landings Association is debt-free, and that's not always common when you have a community of our age approaching our 50th birthday and the developer is no longer here. The general purpose assessment is created by the covenants. And again, think of that as your annual property owner dues. And those dues help fund the day-to-day operations and services, as well as the ongoing capital replacement of assets and infrastructure to maintain and enhance community quality, appearance, and functionality. Also, unlike other communities, all owners get to vote on annual dues. So there's not an annual dues increase if the owners don't approve it. The total amount of the annual dues is allocated between the operating fund and the restricted capital reserves fund. In 2020, the annual dues are $18.50 a lot, and that is split between the operating fund, and that covers your staffing and services, and the restricted capital reserves fund. That's for your asset replacements and repairs. So think about if you're setting money aside to replace a roof on your house, you build that fund up over time to be able to afford that. That's what our capital reserves fund is for. And once money goes into that fund, it can only be used for the repairs and replacements of capital assets. One thing to note is that although we allocate money at the beginning of the year to operations and the reserves fund, if any excess funds are left over in the operating fund, we go ahead and transfer that into the restricted capital reserves fund. The majority of the revenue comes from the annual dues, but you will see some strong other revenue streams such as commercial vehicle registration or rental income, chipping revenue, etc. And it's important to note that this other non-annual dues revenue helps hold down what the actual annual dues needs to be for the association to function. Though this is the part that the association owners vote on as the annual dues. A little more than half of the operating fund expenditures are staffing for things like security and public works. Also landscaping, that's our Brightview landscape contract for about $1 million. Property and casualty insurance, repair and maintenance, utilities, other things like our information technology, lagoon, operating contingency, median center island maintenance, and the like. Now let's look at the average annual capital reserves fund expenditures over the next 5 years. You'll see we'll be spending about $1 million each year on the roads, another $750,000 each year on bridges, structures, equipment. Storm drains comes in at about $340,000 a year. Paths and trails is interesting because we have been converting the paths and trails from asphalt to concrete, which costs a little bit more money up front, but lasts a lot longer. And when sections need to be replaced of the paths, we don't have to replace entire sections. We can just replace the failed concrete panels. These next few slides show your association dollars at work, both operating and reserves. On the left, you see the crew working to clean the storm drains and using the vacuum jetter truck for that. And then on the right, you see crews working to repair a storm drain failure. For this slide, on the left, the bucket truck doing the tree trimming, thinning the canopy. And then, of course, on the right, you have the dump truck removing debris. So again, you're seeing crews, operations, and the equipment that they need, the reserves. The association's street resurfacing program and path replacement program are contracted and are entirely funded through the restricted capital reserve fund. Here you see contractors redecking one of the association's 11 bridges. That's a capital reserves funded project. And on the right, public works employees are working on the lagoon bank stabilization to prevent erosion and protect the lagoon structure wing wall. Those are operating budget expenses. So when was the last increase? The covenants require a community vote, like we mentioned earlier, for any increase, and you have to have at least 60% of owners voting, with 2/3 of those approving. And the last increase was $60 in 2018. We also held a vote that year. And 2/3 of eligible property owners voted, but just under 2/3 approved. 66% voted yes, and we needed 66.7% to approve the increase. So that means the annual dues have been at $18.50 for the last 3 years. So as we look at the next 5 years with the capital replacement reserves, revenues, and expenditures, whether we have an annual dues increase or not, we're still looking at these expenses. So you see they vary by the year, and that's expected because it just depends on when you have your major projects. But if we don't have a dues increase, you see big gaps with the money coming in versus the expenditure. So one year we're even, but the rest of the years you see much higher expenditures than the revenue that can come in. And this is what that looks like. Over the next few years, the reserves begins running out of cash until there is almost no cash left. And what that means is there's not enough money for roads, storm drains, paths, and lagoon overflow structures. What has TLA done to adapt to the flat annual dues over the last few years? One item is to reduce the operating fund costs and services. So items that may be a nice to have versus a must have either been reduced or eliminated. Also diverted all available funds to the restricted capital reserves fund for infrastructure maintenance and replacement, and also deferred some projects that otherwise would have been scheduled by now. The association conducted a community survey that, among other items, sought to understand better the vote results, and also completed a reserve study to determine the degree of financial risk based on the association's reserve levels. These are just some examples of cost eliminations that we have made over the last few years. Seasonal cookouts have been eliminated, along with off-duty county police patrol, marinas marketing, strategic plan projects, closed the recycling center. We turned off the marina live stream cameras that had a hosting charge for them, as well as the interactive website maps that had a hosting charge as well. As we start looking at cost reduction examples, we decreased the center island maintenance, the mailbox sign, painting frequency, contract tree pruning, printing costs, camera maintenance and replacement, and some staffing costs. The association also has been impacted, like so many other businesses, by COVID-19 for both revenues and expenses. One item for revenues is the commercial vehicle registration. That already was trending downward at the beginning of the year versus previous years as the economy began slowing. And now with COVID-19, we expect to end the year more than $100,000 less than our 2020 budget. Also, as previously reported, the Landings Club has ended its security agreement with the association as of the end of May. Now that included 24/7 response by the landing security, as well as scheduled property checks. They're going to a little bit of a different model now, but that means a loss of revenue of close to $70,000 in 2020, as well as almost $119,000 in future years. At this point, there is not a plan to reduce the number of security officers for the Landings Association. Instead, the intent is to redeploy officers that now have the time available that are not spent on club checks and responses to the community pass. This is an area that we have heard continuous complaints about the last few years: golf carts versus cyclists versus pedestrians. And we will get the security golf cart out there more and security personnel out there more for patrols to try to impact this positively. As for expenses, bad debt expense spiked when the assessment payments were due. We saw a much higher delinquency than we had in previous years. That's starting to come back under control a little bit, but we're still looking at potentially $100,000 more than the 2020 budget. We will keep working on that. In addition, We're projecting spending close to $100,000 directly related to COVID-19. Some of that is the personal protective equipment, enhanced cleaning, and also for a short time, our frontline critical workforce employees like public works and security had temporary enhanced pay. That has since ended, but as we were just getting the handle on that, that was an item. The community survey mentioned earlier, we had about half of the owners participate, which is a very strong rate. And the question related to assessments, annual dues, increase to fund future capital expenditures, most favored that versus special assessment vote or borrowing money and putting the association into debt. As reported at the end of last year and the beginning of this year, the Landings Association had an independent reserve specialist conduct an on-site inspection and evaluation of our thousands of capital assets and the reserve funding methodology. And we have close to $80 million in assets. There's a couple of different ways to look at what's the appropriate reserve funding. Certainly if you had 100% full funding, that's the least risk of deferred maintenance or special assessments, but there's a large required contribution. So the National Reserve Standards has an alternate way of looking at this, and it's a minimum 30% to 70% fully funded reserves for an adequate, is what they call it, level of funding. So when the reserve study was complete, it determined the capital reserves fund is too low to maintain the Landings Association assets in the future, and it did recommend having at least the minimum 30% balance of the future costs. So this is the slide we saw earlier that if there are no annual dues increase, you see the reserve fund continue to drop down until we start running out of money. This shows the 30% minimum funded target based on the reserve funding recommendation, and you can see the actual funding. We go down below the 29% down to 8% in 5 years. So what does that look like for the proposed annual dues? This chart we're about to look at made sure that we get the reserves to the 30% minimum, and it also adds in just a few service levels, restores some that we had taken out. Currently, again, each lot is paying $18.50 per year. With this proposal, that goes to $20.70 next year, then $21.70, $22.70. So it's a 3-year average of $21.70. Of note, and as of comparison, the average national annual dues per year is $2,400 to $3,600. So it is an increase, but it's still below the national average. This chart shows that while a fully funded reserves would be a much higher level, this proposal instead calls for an amount that achieves the 30% minimum funded by the end of the 3 years. We looked at a lot of different options and amounts over the years. The increase in the first year is certainly more than the second and the third year, but it's not so much to be overly burdensome and trying to achieve the full 30% in the first year. We talked about where we were in the past and how the association has adapted, but bottom line, why is an increase needed? And there are a few main reasons, one of which is maintaining property values. To prevent a rapid and visible decline in the quality and character of the community and the accompanying decline in property values costs money. Also to prevent higher costs, adequate reserves are needed to stay ahead of the infrastructure deterioration. So if you let a road completely fail, then it's going to cost you more in the long run to replace that than if you're doing preventative maintenance and resurfacing at a set schedule, as one example. And finally, it's more fair to the current and future owners. If you're paying for the assets as you use them, like the roads and the community pass, then you don't stick future prospective buyers with a big bill. This shows that even though the association plans diligently for the replacement of assets, sometimes things don't go as planned. The public works staff, volunteer committee members of the public works committee, the engineering firms that we use all look at our different assets and schedule when we believe they will come due to replacement. But you can see we still have items like premature road and storm drain failures. Hurricane Matthew 2016 led to all sorts of debris and heavy equipment on our roads. Increased rainfall over the last few years has weakened the roadbed. So even with the best planning, there are still premature failures that we need to take into account. This is an example on Shelwyn Drive. You can see the center photo that shows the complete failure of the road down to the base on the right-hand side. You see the soil cement base seeping through. Interestingly, even after these repairs in 2019, we've had other repairs we've had to make on Shelwyn Drive this year. Here's an example of those hidden assets that you can't see. The storm drain pipe under the roadway separated, indicated by the fractures in the road, and the sinking curb section and catch basin. You may recall last year's road failure behind the main gate, and this required base failure repair resulted in double the normal per foot resurfacing costs. The landing's aging stormwater system also is requiring more frequent repairs. You're looking at a root cutter sled right here trying to resolve some root intrusions in the stormwater system. So when we catch these, we can come in with a contractor and take care of them and even make repairs or slip line the system. If we don't get them in time, that results in complete failures to the storm drain system, stormwater system, and ultimately to the roadway. I mentioned before that there were just a few items that were planned to be restored and that are included in the assessment proposal. One is the center island's maintenance. So we had decreased this based on budgetary constraints. You see on this center island, there are some new plantings and those look great, but we didn't have the funding for the turf maintenance. So we would want to increase that. You start talking about aesthetics in the community, not only does that impact current owners, but it impacts people coming to look at our community and therefore the property values. Then also our mailbox and sign painting program, we extended the length of this from restoring 1/3 of the community every year to 1/6. And again, that might be something you just get used to. Okay, I'm used to the mailboxes not looking great and I don't even think about it anymore. But again, you have people looking to buy in the community and the property values. Those are the kind of things they're noticing. Are we keeping up our community or are we not keeping up our community? The Marina Live webcams, this was one of those nice to have, not must haves. So we eliminated it. But for our current owners, this is a good chance to look at both ends of the island. What's the weather looking like? For prospective owners, it's some beauty shots. It says, oh, okay, look at this area. Look at what they have to offer me. And then we plan to bring back the interactive website maps. You'll be able to answer such questions as, does the property behind my lot belong to the Landings Association or the Landings Club? Are there storm drain pipes near my property? Is that a fresh or saltwater lagoon? And where are association maintained walking paths and trails? There is one improvement in this proposal. There is money set aside in the reserves to replace the playground with like-for-like equipment. But we said, let's go back to the drawing board on that. An athletic field complex committee was established in August last year, and we got feedback from community surveys. The committee members really got involved in this and said, let's consider all of the end users for the athletic field, the playground, the basketball court, etc. And what makes the most sense for this? Do we want to just have what we've had, or do we want to have something better for the next 20, 30 years? 3 vendors submitted designs. Landscape Structures provided the most unique designs that had high durability and longevity and inclusivity and play for differently abled people once we can have that close contact again. And so the Athletic Field Complex Committee modified and fine-tuned the designs. They include a pour-in-place path. We'll look at that in a second. A small pavilion for shade because there's so many users out there and there's really no shade there. And also resurface the basketball courts. So this is what the design looks like. Again, it provides for quite a variety of play from zip lines to rock climbing, etc. for different age groups, different kind of swings where you can do with kids, with friends. And also it has this is just examples, but a rubberized path. So this will go around the athletic complex. And we do have walking paths, but again, they're concrete. So if you want something a little more low impact, easier on the joints for walking, running, etc., this rubberized path will help out for that. One thing we do here is, well, I don't have any kids, I don't use the playground, why do I care about this? Maybe the person buying your house or maybe the person looking in the community does or has grandkids, and that's a big draw to them. And that's just one area of our community where, whether you're a club member or not, everybody can find something to do here and everybody is allowed to use it. What if the next vote doesn't pass? We looked at this chart earlier where the annual dues are split between the operating fund and the restricted capital reserves fund. And there's only so much money to go around. So you either have to look at reducing the operating fund, the restricted capital reserves fund, or a combination of both if there's not an annual dues increase. And certainly we need to maintain our critical infrastructure such as the roads and community paths. So if we don't have an increase going forward, we will have to shift more money from the operating fund over to the capital reserves fund. So that does mean a reduction in staffing and services so that we can maintain the critical assets. Therefore, the board would need to consider the following: reducing the staffing levels we just discussed, which would then lead to further reducing service levels such as mowing frequency, center island maintenance, which we would like to increase, street sweeping frequency, lagoon treatments, cleaning of facilities, street restriping, and so on. Also, we have to look at our assets. I mean, obviously we need the roads, but are there amenities and assets that require expenditures for maintenance or replacement that are, again, nice to have but not need to have? Playground equipment, it's just about at the end of its useful life. So do we have the money to replace it and even improve it, or do we need to remove it? What about the Marsh Tower? McWhorter Bridge is due for an extensive redecking within the next few years and then replacement further out. It's a nice convenience to have and would love to keep it. Then you have other bridges, including lagoon bridges, monument signs and directional signs, picnic tables or other outdoor seating, security cameras, sliding security gates, things like that will have to be explored. If owners do approve the proposal, here are some key takeaways. The proposal achieves the minimum 30% funding level for the adequate capital reserves. That is so important. Otherwise, asset replacement and repair has to be deferred or assets removed. And this is the biggest takeaway of the entire proposal. Also, 4 operational service levels will be restored to their previous level as discussed. And the athletic field complex will be improved and also have the user base expanded with the rubberized walking path installed. So some key takeaways here. The proposal calls for moving from $18.50 per lot, which we've been paying the last 3 years, to $20.70, $21.70, and $22.70. That gets us to the 30% minimum amount required for the reserves and maintains current service levels and just restores just a few. It also provides 58% of the increase will be going to capital reserves fund. And then the last point at the bottom, a total of close to $9 million will be allocated to the capital reserves fund from annual dues revenue over the next 3 years. The next steps include community meetings, virtual or otherwise, in this time of COVID-19, drop-ins, etc. We'll also be posting information on landings.org/annual-dues, where you can find a lot of supporting documentation. The intent is to have a good dialogue with the community and answer any questions that may arise. Then we need to finalize the voting packet, and the intent is to have the vote in September, maybe into the early part of October. Things to consider. Quality amenities and capital reserves fund make our community more attractive to buyers. And it's essential to the landings future and your property values. So think about, like I talked about the roof earlier, we maintain our homes and we also must maintain our community. It's the Landings 50th birthday in 2022, and let's celebrate with a community we're all proud of. Consider what's best for the entire community. Also, we want to make the next 50 years even more successful for current and future owners. Our amenities, our capital reserves fund, make our entire community more attractive to those buyers. It is essential to the landing's future and your property values. We maintain our home, we must maintain our property, our community. It's time to act, and again, ultimately, it is your decision.